all Sri Lankans. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in Parliament with an overwhelming majority. 212 voted in favour of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, 1 against, 1 abstention, and 10 parliamentarians were not present in the chamber during the voting. Now, what does it mean to the general public? What is the way forward? What are the salient features of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution? Will it be a success story? Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Let me introduce our guest this evening, Dr. Pakisar Saramuthu, the Executive Director of the Centre for Policy Alternatives, and also the leader of the Liberal Party, Professor Rajiv Jasingh, who is also a parliamentarian. Our journalists this evening are Nadeem Majid, on to my immediate right. On to my immediate left is Sonali Wanika Baduge. And on my far left is Faraz Shaukat Ali, who is an independent investigative journalist. The speakers will get 4 minutes each for their opening remarks. Let's get the ball rolling. The ball is in Dr. Saramuthu's court.
Thank you. I think when we discuss politics in Sri Lanka today, of course, the most significant event is the passage of this 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment was a kind of centerpiece, if you like, of the campaign in the presidential election, of the winning campaign in the presidential election. And what it was to focus on was either abolition or reduction of the powers of the executive presidency. The executive presidency has been held up as an exemplar of the consolidation of powers in a single office, which facilitates authoritarianism, lack of accountability and transparency as far as governance and government is concerned. I think the argument in the election was also therefore that it reinforced the worst excesses of the Rajapaksa dynastic project. Now, the 19th Amendment, as far as I'm concerned, didn't go far enough in redressing the balance of power back in favor of Parliament, in favor of the legislature, and away from the executive. However, it is a movement in the right direction. It is a movement in the right direction, and in that respect, to me, is a commencement of a constitutional reform project which will have to be taken on by the next Parliament, and I hope that the next Parliament will really be up to it. I think it is important here to note that, for the first time, you have a president who has been willing to give up powers and actually advocated and lobbied that this be done. Previous holders of the office have promised and have notoriously failed to fulfill that commitment. There are other dimensions as well to the 19th Amendment which I welcome. The right to information being a fundamental right. I think that's very important. The reintroduction of the independent oversight commissions which were there under the 17th Amendment, and as a consequence now the effects of the 18th Amendment have been jettisoned effectively. But what I do want to emphasize very much is that a large part of the rationale as well in respect of campaigning on the basis of the governance deficit was also the argument that one needed to bridge that deficit to create an enabling, facilitating environment to deal with the other big issue that faces this country. And that is the issue with regard to a political settlement of the ethnic conflict, a constitutional framework that accommodates the aspirations and grievances of all the peoples of this country. So that is the challenge ahead. I think we've made a start in the right direction, but much more needs to be done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pakisar Saramuthu. Much more needs to be done. Professor Rajiv Jasingh, your opening remarks.
Well, I agree with Sara that the 19th Amendment is a good start, but I believe that it wasn't really properly produced through the sort of consultation mechanism that was promised in the President's manifesto. The President's manifesto actually suggests that there would be an advisory committee that would actually discuss all the changes that were needed, and the 2 changes that I think Sara asserted are fundamental: reduce the power of the executive presidency, strengthen Parliament. Now, this has not been done. And I think one of the most fundamental problems of the way the present government is addressing President Sirisena's manifesto, which to me is an excellent work that I can say so having participated in actually writing it up. There are about 6 fundamental promises that hang together. And these have all been ignored except the 19th Amendment, which initially was designed not to reduce the power of the executive, but to transfer much of the power of the executive from the president to the prime minister. And I think there was a lot of sleight of hand involved, and I'm glad we were able to defeat that. But if you take the strengthening of Parliament, there is a commitment here. It's the first thing that should have happened to revise standing orders. And how do you strengthen Parliament? You strengthen the committee system that is stressed in this. Nothing has been done about it. I actually proposed a motion on this 2 years ago, and it was dodged. The Speaker wouldn't even put it to Parliament. When Parliament met, I was told the Prime Minister didn't want it, but Lakshman Kiriyala, like Dinesh Gunawardene before him, encouraged it being put. We had one meeting. The minutes of that meeting show how quickly we can work. We had excellent participation. Mr. Sumantharan, Dinesh Gunawardene, the Deputy Speaker, who's a very bright young man. We moved forward. We have proposed that the finance committees come under the opposition, that government must respond to all the recommendations of these committees, either by following the recommendation or explaining in writing why it can't be done. As the Secretary General said, Parliament is not the executive, but it must have oversight. We have changed the impeachment procedure, which everyone knows was appalling, the way Shirani Bandaranaike was impeached. Now, none of those is come before Parliament. When I want to do consultative committees, I was told the Prime Minister didn't want it done. He had the draft. When I asked the lady who did his draft for him, he said not to put it till the 19th Amendment was passed. So you see, his priority is very clear. Power. It's the same as we had before. But you have to divide power up. And as Sarah said, Parliament must be strengthened. Then, nothing has been done about the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct is essential. I thought Anukumar Dissanayake had done nothing, and I told him, what did you do? He was entrusted with it. He said, I gave a draft 2 months ago. And then he said, the advisory committee hardly meets. Nothing was done about electoral reform. I think Ranil Wickremesinghe had a certain contempt for parliamentarians. He came out with this when the whole question came up about Arjuna Mahendra and the bond issue. He said, no, parliamentarians won't understand what bonds are. They might think it's James Bond. Now, I think that was a very nasty thing to say. But I do recognize, when we're talking about consultative committees, the Constitutional Council, one former minister said, MPs are too busy. It was a very polite way of saying maybe they weren't up to it. But that is because we have an electoral system that prevents them from concentrating. So I think once we have an electoral system which goes back to individuals on the lines of parliamentarians we had in the past, I think they could contribute much more, and the consultative committees could play a much greater role, which is envisioned in the standing orders, but they do nothing now about legislation, about financial oversight. None of these come up. So I think it is essential to actually take this manifesto as a whole and fulfill it. And the 19th Amendment is only a very small part.
Now I open the floor for questions from the journalists. Before that, just a reminder to our viewers, you could log on to our Facebook page, Face the Nation on MTV Sports, and also pose questions to the guests who are here today. Dr. Pakiswa Saranamuthu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, and also Professor Rajiv Vijayasinghe, Parliamentarian and leader of the Liberal Party. Nadim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Shamir. My first question is to you, Professor Vijayasinghe. You were talking about the amending of the standing orders and the introduction of the Code of Conduct for MPs. Now, these were, if you look at the diary, the 100 days diary, these were things that were supposed to be done within the first fortnight, I believe. You've been an advocate for amending standing orders in Parliament. I'm guessing because you played a part in drafting the manifesto, your input there is clearly visible. My question is this: do you think that you and Anukumar Dissanayake, in terms of the Code of Conduct, have failed to keep up pressure on the government and on MPs to have these changes implemented? to have these
Well,
enacted?
with regard to the code of conduct, I have played my part in that I sent to both the Minister for Good Governance, Karu Jayasuriya, and to Vijayadasa Rajapaksa codes of conduct. Why? In the brief time I was minister, I actually got a code of conduct for university professors from the UGC. I mean, during that week they worked almost as hard as I did. But I told them this is not good enough. This is about academic stuff. I want moral things. For instance, I said, surely we should have something that says you mustn't be appointing relations to jobs. You know, there's nothing illegal about it, but frankly, it should not have happened. So these are areas where I think we should move. Karu Jayasuriya told me, he agreed with what I said, he answers letters, but he said, you know, it's very difficult to change the culture. And I said, Mr. Jayasuriya, that's what we are here for. We won the election to change. We actually had a meeting in his office because when I was in the government parliamentary group, I proposed that we have a subcommittee to give him ideas. That was not even minuted. What they minuted was how to get vehicles for members. But Karu had a meeting of the subcommittee, had a very nice man who was supposed to be in charge. None of the members of the UNP who were on the subcommittee even bothered to turn up. Vijayadasa Rajapaksa didn't even reply to my letter. I sent a very clear statement by an excellent man called Nagaranda Kodituakku, who had been an advocacy, legal advocacy chap, about the rules for judges, because while I believe absolutely in the independence of the judiciary, they must also have rules.
Getting on to the topic of the standing orders, though, and strengthening oversight, the oversight function in Parliament. I mean, the 19th Amendment does give curtail some powers of the executive president and does strengthen Parliament to a certain extent. But given that Parliament, do you believe that the structure in Parliament is broken? And if so, how can you trust this Parliament with anything?
Well, as I said, it goes together. You need a new electoral system which will actually produce parliamentarians, to put it very politely, who can concentrate on a small electorate plus on their legislative and oversight duties. I think the way that we're trying to formulate the 20th Amendment, where you also have people who will not be particularly responsible for a constituency, will allow for more thought. But it is also up to the parties. Now, parties, when they nominate a candidate for a constituency, can actually give greater weight to intellectual and political thought than they can in this mad Manapa system that we now have, where you have to have popular figures with money. So I think the change of electoral system is an essential prerequisite. But I also think you need to have the committee structured better. And you know, when we were in India, the Indians gave us a whole document about what they wanted, and I told the speaker, why don't we follow up? But none of my colleagues who went attended. Even Sumantaran, whom I liked very much, he did nothing to get the committee together. You know, I said, write to the speaker. You know, I can't single-handedly send 4 letters a year if nobody else helps. Dinesh Gunawardena was the only person. Poor John Amaratunga, when I told him as chief opposition whip, and he said, yes, we must. And nothing followed.
Sonali?
Yes, Nadeem. Now, Professor, the Herculean task of passing the 19th Amendment was finally fulfilled 2 days ago. Now, you proposed a large number of amendments at the third reading of the amendment. Let's get into those. 19th Amendment is now passed. So what can we do in furtherance of that? Let's go through several of the alterations that you had proposed.
Well, one of them, when it seemed that the Prime Minister was not interested in electoral reform, was electoral reform. So I accepted because the President guaranteed that that would go ahead. So, and the Anglican speaker said that's not relevant. The second, I think, important thing I put forward, which I was very keen on, was another promise in this manifesto, which is a limited cabinet and a scientifically constructed cabinet.
Can you define scientifically constructed cabinet?
It means making sure that work that coheres is under the same ministry. For instance, if you all have studied the gazettes of the last 2 months, every week the Prime Minister changes people's jobs. And the people who seem to benefit are Ranil and Rishad. So the Prime Minister now has sacred areas under him. Rishad Badiuddin has got the CWE. He has got Consumer Affairs Authority, all of which were with Jayavikram Perera previously, and Jayavikram Perera has nothing. Public Administration Ministry from the start didn't have divisional and district secretariats. How can you run a public administration thing without that? Then you had higher education and highways. It doesn't make sense. So So this was promised. There's been no thought. When we were discussing amendments, and I put it forward, Ranil Wickremesinghe actually said, yes, we can probably manage with 15. So I said, do it. But he said, no, we can't do it now. My whole point is, if you make a promise, you can't run around saying, we promised to do this. Lakshman Kirakar saying, we promised to bring back the 17th Amendment. Rubbish. There's nothing about the 17th Amendment in any of this. But there is much more that no one has even looked at. And I think you need a cabinet where financial accountability is there. For instance, in COPE, we find when we ask questions, they say we have no documents because that was when it was in another ministry. Parliament was telling me the other day, we don't know what to do with questions because last week it had to go to this ministry, this week it has to go to this minister. I mean, this chaos. We were all very upset when Mahinda Rajapaksa kept multiplying the cabinet and making stupid ministries like Botanical Gardens. But case in point, Botanical Gardens, where is it? Now it's with tourism. Once it was with environment. How can they plan when they last came up before COPE? There were only 2 of us in COPE.
So what you're basically saying is that the entire structure of governance, of the government, of the state needs to be revamped.
Absolutely, and we promised to do it.
How do you go about doing something
what
like
Ranil Wickremesinghe should have done was, as he said, had a National Advisory Council consisting of representatives of...
Welcome back to Face the Nation. We were in the Q&A from our journalists to our guests. Faraz, do you have a question?
Yes, Professor Wijesinghe. The 19th Amendment precludes dual citizens from contesting. Is this aimed at a few people? And is it possible for them to give up their foreign nationality and then contest?
I have to say I thought it was a very unnecessary part of the 19th Amendment, and I think, as you said, it was probably aimed at particular people. I don't, however, think it's a desperately serious thing because, as you said, I think anyone who's deeply committed to wanting to do good in this country could give up their other citizenship and then come and contest. And I think most countries that have given people dual citizenship will, be happy to give it back if they fail.
But will they be allowed to continue to live in those foreign countries?
Well, if they give it up,
yeah,
they will probably not. But since their families might be there and be settled and would not give up the citizenship,
right,
I'm sure there's provision for them to go back and settle down. So I don't think it's such a major issue.
And is it as major having the governor of the central bank from a foreign country?
I think that was an enormous mistake. I think that was a great pity. I think also getting a work permit straight away shows a certain sleight of hand. In all fairness, I believe 2 very able people in Sri Lanka were offered the job before. One of them told me he realized he just couldn't work with these people. And although he did tell me that had someone like Eran Wickremesinghe, Minister of Finance, he would have been able to carry on. So I think in the end they had to take someone who was willing to fall in with their plans, and I'm afraid I find the whole business about the bonds disgraceful. And I suspect that these things, because knowing Ranil Wickremesinghe, he plans things well in advance. And as someone said, he's not corrupt in the sense that he gets money to buy Maitri jewels, but he has long, been encouraging the business community so that they get donations. And I suspect a lot of the profits will be ploughed into the UNP election campaign.
But to be fair, I think Mr. Wickremesinghe must have wanted to act quickly because Governor Cabral resigned straight away after the election results were known.
No, I think certainly should have appointed somebody immediately, but I don't think it was that necessary to bring someone from abroad. And I think if they had made certain guarantees, they could have got perfectly able people, some of whom, as I said, I know offered the job.
Dr. Saramuthu, just a question to you. You said that the president was elected because of a certain reason, that is to abolish the executive presidency or to limit the powers of the limitless president. Are you satisfied with the 19th Amendment to the Constitution?
No, I'm not. As I said, I would have preferred it to have gone a lot further. And a lot of the points that Rajiv was making, and particularly with regard to the parliamentary oversight and all of that, is something I wholeheartedly agree with.
But you said the president was willing to give up his powers.
I'm assuming that as he has been willing to give up his powers with regard to the 19th Amendment, it won't stop there. There is a pledge to continue with the constitutional reform project, and one hopes that he will put behind it his considerable weight and reputation as far as the country is concerned. This is a process that is by no means complete.
Dr. Saramuthu, do you think that you can strengthen Parliament and strengthen oversight in Parliament by diminishing the executive and transferring the powers of the executive to the legislature?
Well, when you transfer the power to the legislature, it's important to make sure that that legislature is of a capacity and caliber that can take on that responsibility. You know, that is what is important.
Has there been a
two have to
legislature
be
in the history of Sri Lanka that has been of that caliber and capacity?
Certainly. We've had legislatures in the past which have been much more capable and with people of considerable caliber dealing with committees in Parliament. I mean, you think of the Bernard Soizas, etc., who were, you know, heading oversight committees on finance. So we've had that in the past. You see, the point about the constitutional reform process is that it needs to be coherent, it needs to be complementary. The reduction of the powers of the executive needs to be complemented and reinforced by the strengthening of the capacity of the legislature.
Do you think the 19th Amendment has done anything to strengthen the capacity of the legislature?
Not enough, not by any stretch of the imagination, and that's why that's the important part of this process that has to be pushed in the next Parliament.
What do you think needs to be done? What would you like to have seen through
Well,
that?
I would like to see, I mean, as Rajiva was talking about, the whole question of strengthening the committee system of Parliament to begin with. You know, what is the point in having a Parliament which does not, quite frankly, live up to its responsibilities in respect of governance? And what is the point in talking about governance if these people are not going to have the capacity to be able to do this?
Professor Vijay Singh, you've been an advocate of the tripartite system of governance, basically near absolute separation of powers between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. But through the 19th Amendment and through what is being the vision of the government and also the president appears to be transferring executive powers to the legislature, a merger between the parliament and the executive. In such a backdrop, do you think that it's wise? Do you think it's wise to transfer the powers?
No, I don't think you transfer executive powers to legislature. As I said with regard to the standing order amendments, it's not the executive power. It is the strengthening of the oversight and the legislative power. I mean, one thing that absolutely horrified me when I joined Parliament, I was given a book.
Wouldn't you have preferred it though if the process was reversed and you were removing the executive from the legislature?
Absolutely. In fact, Sarah reminded me at a seminar the other day that when we were both in the Liberal Party, he was vice president, I was president, neither of us had any power at all. We had an ideal presidency. I had no powers at all except to preside. And Sarah's vice president was the same, but we contributed, I think, intellectually. And he reminded me that our suggestion then was absolute separation. And I think we both think that would be a better system where the president appoints ministers capable of doing their job who are not politicians. But you have to then strengthen the elected representatives with strong, even stronger oversight capacity and financial controls. Now, if we are not getting that, the next best thing is a situation where you must have a limited cabinet. You know, my father said once, and he was hauled up before a privileges committee, he said once the problem is every parliamentarian wants to be a minister. And every minister wants to be a minister in charge of construction. You know, my father was a very wise man. But we need to change that and actually limit the cabinet. And that is why I'm horrified that we did nothing about that. We have introduced a limit of 30, but they have actually said that after the next election, you can have, they were trying to get unlimited number of ministers, which in the Prime Minister's book is bribery, I gather, because he hauled up the former president. But the Prime Minister has actually entrenched bribery in the Constitution.
For us?
Dr. Saramuthu, what were these sort of draconian powers that have not been clipped away from the president after this 19th Amendment?
Well, I mean, to start off with, the current amendment, as I understand it, says that the president will decide on the number of ministers and on their powers and functions. The dismissal and appointment of particular individuals is to be on the advice of the Prime Minister. Yes? So, I mean, what you have, therefore, is a sort of two-headed, two-pronged executive in that respect, and a lot is therefore going to depend on their ability to work together, which I think is, you leave it, it's a sort of contingent factor. Then with regard to secretaries to ministries, for example, again, I would like to see that there is a continuity as far as the bureaucracy is concerned, and that the secretaries to ministries are not appointed by political heads, rather that they come up through the service and they're appointed in that they're depoliticized, in partisan terms, depoliticized. So I think there are powers like that that still remain with the executive presidency. I mean, I would like to, if we can't move to, as Rajiv mentioned, that complete separation of powers a la the United States, if you can't move to that, I would like to move to a system where you have much more of a parliamentary democracy, like what you have in the United Kingdom.
So under this, after this 19th Amendment, do you envisage another scenario like previously when Mrs. Kumaratunga took over some ministerial positions and so on?
Well, I don't think the 19th Amendment as it stands at the present moment precludes that.
Right.
It doesn't preclude
so
that.
They haven't achieved anything of any real substance?
No, but you have moved to a situation in which there are 2 terms for the presidency, there are fixed terms. The president's powers with regard to the dissolution of parliament have been curtailed. As I said, with regard to appointment and dismissal of ministers, there is a requirement of consulting the prime minister of the day.
Well, what does that really entail, consulting? I mean, does he just listen to him and then goes ahead and does what he wants anyway?
Well, if it is, if there is going to be a major clash in terms of the president refusing, within the ambit of those constitutional powers, to seek the advice or consult the prime minister, then I think it goes back, invariably will go back to Parliament in terms of deciding as to what should happen in that situation.
Professor Vijay Singha, let's talk a bit about the Constitutional Council. There was a bit of a crisis with regard to it, and finally it was decided that there would be the Speaker, the Prime Minister, Opposition Leader, and 3 intellectuals. Now, before the show, we had an interesting conversation on a bit of a paradoxical situation that has arisen with regard to the CC. Let's talk a bit about your opinions and about the paradox that has arisen.
Well, to me, the Constitutional Council is an extraordinary creation which is unprecedented in the whole world, except Nepal has something of the sort. And everywhere else in the world where you need a check on the power of the president, and I wholeheartedly agree that's necessary. In fact, Sarah and I were part of the Liberal Party that first said this 25 years ago, when everyone else allowed Jaya to appoint anyone he liked and no one questioned it. We said there must be checks. The usual check is a parliamentary check. For instance, in America, it's the Senate. Now, I proposed an amendment which I withdrew because I felt the Constitutional Council envisaged in this original 19th Amendment was a nonsense. And what I said when I pointed this out in discussion, a minister told me, well, I don't think parliamentarians should do it because they don't have the time. I think he may have also meant they didn't have the capacity. So I took his point and said there should be an advisory council with written advice, which must be taken note of. But the final approval of anything by the President should be by a consultative committee of Parliament, followed by Parliament as a whole. And since I envisage with standing order changes that the chairman of the consultative committee should be an opposition member, it would be a really open discussion. Now, I am one of those who doesn't believe that the second part of the 18th Amendment, the Parliamentary Council, was wrong. But I think the Parliamentary Council turned into a joke because Ranil Wickremesinghe has boycotted it. A Parliamentary Council is meant to comment on any appointment.
A quick question, Professor Vijay Singha. Do you agree with the 19th Amendment of the Constitution, yes or no?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I felt it was a very good advance. Like Sarah says, I wish it would have gone further. But I believe it should have gone further, even more than him. For instance, one of my amendments, and thank you, Sarah, for saying this, because I was horrified that no one in what I would call the so-called intellectuals or civil society, or whatever you like to call people like my friend here, did not object to the fact that the secretaries to ministries are appointed by the President. You know, if you talk of independent commissions, The Public Service Commission is the most important of these. And I don't, well, I'm not saying I disagree with Sara because I think he means it himself. When the power of the presidency is reduced, it is not only Parliament. There are other agencies that must be there to defend the people from executive power.
Do you agree, Dr. Sararamuthu, to what President Rajendra Singh is saying?
No, I do. I mean, I do. My point with regard to secretaries is an example of that agreement. Yeah.
But Sara, can I say, and thank you for saying this, that, you know, when I proposed that amendment, no one in civil society got up and said, this is outrageous, that the president should continue. And I have proposed a 23rd amendment, which won't come up because it's been sent to the Prime Minister and it'll take forever, saying that those two clauses should be amended, that the secretary should be appointed by the Public Service Commission, and that permanent secretaries, which happen everywhere else in the world except in America, which is a different system, you shouldn't lose the secretaries when the government changes. What I did for the 19th Amendment was I added a clause saying the President should appoint secretaries. Ranil wanted it on his advice, which is equally nonsensical, another member of the executive, on the advice and consultation with the Public Service Commission. Now, I can understand my colleagues in Parliament not wanting this because they're politicians. But why didn't people like Sara shout about this? Thank you for shouting here.
A constitution should be complementary and coherent. The people's supremacy should reign supreme through a constitution. Was the 19th Amendment to the Constitution brought in a haphazard way, like the 17th Amendment to the Constitution? What exactly happened there? All this and more after this short commercial break. This is Face the Nation.